one of the core benefits of, if you think of the liberal arts as produce, it's liberal arts produce something, as opposed to, what do they produce? Well, one of the things they produce is a way to understand the world and how to learn and how to put things together. Not just little bits of knowledge, but how to piece it all together.
Dr. Stokes, thank you for joining me on A Flames and Crowns. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. The best way I can describe this is like me getting to know you was initially through email, and there was just tons of humor, and I appreciated that. And I thought to myself, you know what, Dr. Stokes is my guy. I think we'll get along just fine. I think just to begin with, I'd like to get a bit about your background. Where did you grow up, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I grew up born and raised in Florida, Central Florida, and stayed there until basically, we're talking about early 30s, and then changed careers, which is another story, from engineering to philosophy. I usually joke because I went from engineering to philosophy because of the money was so good in philosophy. So
booming industry.
Yeah. So grew up in Central Florida and made it, went to school for philosophy in Northeast, Midwest, and then made it out here.
Amazing.
So we're a long way from
a long way
started.
Away. Yeah. I was just in Tampa just a couple of months ago at this point. Beautiful. One of the things I know that you enjoyed doing was surfing, right? Like, you were supposed to become a professional surfer.
No, that was
what happened.
Yeah, no, well, first of all, my skin was just like, I get fried walking out to the mailbox, so I have to be careful with that. And then, it's funny, you don't get to do a lot of surfing here. I mean, like, you can go over to the West Coast every once in a while.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. What kind of household did you grow up in? Like, what was that like? What was your relationship like with your parents? And do you have any distinct memories of that time?
Yeah. So grew up my folks were divorced when I was 5. My mom raised my brother and I, younger brother, and alone for the most part, and before she got married again later. But yeah, great household. Grew up in a believing household. My mom was a believer, and I would have said I was, and I could have been, but it was kind of I didn't really understand the gospel until probably like second, third year in college.
Wow. Okay. Let's get into that. What was it that you came across? Was it a conversation with a friend? Was it just some of the material you were exposed to? Just what was that?
Yeah, no, it was weird. It was I was a first class underachiever throughout junior high, high school, first years of college. And it's funny. One story when it comes to math. Hopefully, we'll talk about math a little bit. I teach mathematics. I've written a mathematics textbook, but back when I first started college, I had to go to a community college because I couldn't get into a state college. And in the community college, I was in remedial algebra, not even college algebra. And I failed it. So the girl I was dating, who ends up becoming my wife, very just brilliant. I was thinking, what does she see in me? Like what? So she must not be that. There's some give and take there. I said, well, how do you do so well in math? What is it? What's the trick? And she diagnostic questions like, so how are you doing on the? You're obviously doing poorly on the exams, and how are you doing on the homework? I was like, what do you mean? like, yeah, no. So you're supposed to, and she said, yeah, when you do the homeworks, how, when you go through the problems over and over, how do you do on those? I had no idea what she was talking about. Oh, you mean you do problems? You actually, I thought you just get it. And after that, it was like, okay, well, now it's starting to make sense. You have to study. Oh, I mean, talk about, it was ridiculous. Foolish young man. So it was probably, I guess it was the second semester. I do not know why, but I just started reading my Bible every day. There was no lightning bolt. There was no voice. There was just, I look back and I'm like, I have no idea what that was. So I just started reading. And then I also at the same time said, well, why don't I start studying? Like actually trying to do well in school.
Yeah.
And I tried and started doing well in school, and things just, it was just weird. It was just this weird kind of, out of the blue. I don't know how to explain it, humanly speaking.
Right.
And,
irresistible grace.
Yeah, no, it wasn't me. It was just, just so thankful for that. But but it was still, so I went into engineering where you need math. So did a bachelor's and a master's in engineering, but I was having lots of doubts about Christianity and theism, just God in general, and not just when it came to science and religion, but just generally. And so I got to the point where I couldn't even read scripture about it. I'd read, is this true? I mean, it was bad.
Yeah.
And I had some friends at church who were going to seminary, and they started handing me books by these folks. It turns out that what they were handing me was either philosophy, theology, or something called apologetics.
Yeah.
And I started, wait a second. People had already been, they've been thinking about this. They've written about this.
Right.
Why am I like the last person to know?
Right.
And it was so great. It was just a lifeline. And again, it was an intellectual lifeline, but it was also done in this, a community, and where I could trust people and I could express my doubts, and they were.
Where is this, by the way?
This is Central Florida.
So this is Central Florida still. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I started going to. I wanted more. So I started taking classes at the seminary that these guys were going to, and just taking classes just for fun. I mean, for fun, not for credit, just for to help me understand. And it was amazing. And eventually, I was thinking, well, why didn't I know about this stuff? And could I help people know about this stuff? And my advisor there, great man, Charles McKenzie, has passed away, said, well, why don't you go on and get a PhD in philosophy? I'm thinking, I've already done my school. I've done that. And eventually, eventually my wife and I prayed quite a bit about it over time as I was taking classes. And I ended up getting an opportunity to go to a great study with a great Christian philosopher out of the blue, kind of. And so we had to make that decision to go from, we already had 2 children, go from engineering to back to school.
Wow. Yeah. Was that a tough transition for you?
It wasn't. It was actually a super exciting time. Yeah. So my wife, Christine, she and I have been praying about it so long, and this opportunity came along that is exactly what we needed, where it was so obvious that, because it was such a great opportunity, and opportunities like that don't come to people like me unless God intervenes. And so it's like, okay, that made it a lot clearer for us to be able, hey, okay, yeah, we can step out and do this. And so we were excited, and it ended up going back to school. I got to study with, there's a Christian philosopher, Nicholas Wolterstorff, who was at Yale, who we'd been reading about in seminary. It was like all the philosophy nerds were like, man, Wolterstorff. And there was another guy, his name is Alvin Flanagan. We're just kind of like silly fanboys, though rightly so. And, but ended up being able to study with Wolterstorff at Yale, and then going on to study with Flanagan and some other great philosophers at Notre Dame. And it was just so it was one of those things where this, kid who used to surf and skateboard and do nothing and not be able to do math, and God takes that and turns it around in a way that makes it, because I was really reluctant to change careers. I didn't want to do it just because it was fun or anything. It was like, okay, this isn't not about me. And so but it's always hard to figure out, when are you thinking about you versus when are you thinking about the Lord and others? And so, we were really both aware of that. And this opportunity came along, and
you took that. What do you think is the biggest thing that you learned in your studies at Yale and at Notre Dame? Like, what are your big takeaways? Why was that such a shaping influence on you?
Yeah. So one great aspect of it was just seeing other Christians grapple with similar problems, ideas, things like that. Right. And people that were far smarter than me who acknowledged, I see why you would doubt that, or see why, and didn't just say, well, you need to believe. And, I'm just glad I believe. And to see them acknowledge the problems and then also grapple with them in a way that wasn't hokey, where it wasn't this triumphalism in the sense that anybody who doesn't believe this must have something wrong with them. They didn't have that attitude. It was just careful reasoning, but also taking into account, how the Spirit moves, how other things than reason factor in, and just learning kind of how to think in slow motion. It seems like you'd want to think fast, but when you're thinking about like the most fundamental things in life, you really got to give them a lot of thought, and we're not trained to do that. And so it was a lot of just wax on, wax off training through that. So that was a wonderful thing, being trained, and then also seeing these people that I respected who had a lifetime of dealing with these questions and still being faithful.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of which, Plantinga actually, he endorsed this book, wrote a foreword for it.
It cost me a lot of money.
I bet it did. Yeah, but I mean, he seems to have played a very prominent role in your life. You reference him very deeply. Just what sort of, like, what did you learn from him in a very profound way, beyond just even lessons, but just as the man?
Yeah, again, I think a lot of it is just seeing what kind of man he is, and knowing, and also seeing him really be faithful of the Lord. And it's kind of like he had gone the distance, so someone who was older than me, which is so great to have, like people that have gone before you and have examples of those, but just a great sense of humor and just sharp as a tack. And at the same time, very humble about what philosophy could do, what he could do in philosophy, and just a great example of how to be a responsible Christian person who thinks hard and about these deep topics, which I think is something that we all need to be doing at different levels. I'll never be doing it at his level, and it's just, but seeing that, and then seeing lots of other Christian philosophers of different denominations, and seeing Catholic philosophers and all, and just seeing how there was a lot of unity in certain respects.
Yeah. One of the things that you noted very profoundly in your book is just how philosophy just kind of opened your mind up to so many things. And there's a sense in which I think you kind of make a reference to science and engineering, and how philosophy just opened your mind up to understanding those kinds of things that much more.
Yeah.
What's the link between those things? How do you describe what that was?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That was hugely, well, first of all, it was a shock. So I went through engineering basically just, okay, I can do the problems, and I liked it all right, but I didn't love it. It was great. But it wasn't like, hey, I'd do this in my spare time or anything like that. But it was mostly just very much, all right, here are the laws of physics, here are the rules of math, here's how you apply these to that. And, and that is hard to keep up with. Right. But you don't ever go behind the scenes and ask, how does, and it's never even pointed out. So I don't even think I had the wonder of like, how does all this work? Like, how would, the fact that we can apply mathematics to the physical world and that it works, we're so used to that. It doesn't surprise us. In fact, we learn to hate it, because like word problems in math, you're like, that's basically, you're applying math to the world. In math, and word problems are the worst. And you're like, and so people end up just kind of, it's just, there's no time for thinking about it and the foundations and how it fits into a worldview and all of that. And looking at philosophy. So when I went into philosophy, I had my goal wasn't to see how math worked. Right. My goal was, I wanted to understand science and mathematics more so that I could, I didn't struggle as much with what I thought were apparent conflicts. But I went, and also for doing apologetics in terms of looking at how you form beliefs, religious epistemology. How much do people rely on faith even in ordinary circumstances? All that kind of stuff. So I was interested in that, and then I was in a class with another great Christian philosopher, Peter Van Inwagen, and he was talking about one of Plato's views, not so much about Plato himself, but something related. And it was whether or not there were what Plato calls these forms. Mm-hmm. But he was talking about, he talked about numbers, like, and numbers are forms. And I'm like, what? So as he started talking about that, I was like, I'd never thought at all about this. Plus, he had the craziest argument, I thought at the time, where, you know what? If you believe these things, then you have to believe that numbers exist, not just in your mind. But I was like, hold on, I'm still getting used to coming from science and engineering, where it's like that's just not even, you don't ever talk about those kinds of things. Right. So I was fascinated. And that got me into the philosophy of mathematics. I'd already been looking at philosophy of science, and then how science, particularly physics, uses mathematics. And then I learned that actually the interaction between math and how it's applied to the physical world ends up being a theme that goes back to Plato, and you can follow it all the way through history, and that's how the liberal arts got started. Yeah. And I was like, wait. And I didn't go looking for any of this. If anything, I was like, okay, I figured I was out of math, I was out of all of that, and I'm doing philosophy. It's fun to think about some of these other things, but then it was like, it turned out to be so central unexpectedly. Right. So it's not one of those things where I am so into math that I'm going to find it in everything. Yeah. It's like, that's just what I'm going to do. It wasn't like that at all. It was more like I kind of was done with that part of my life. Yeah. And it kind of chased me down, so it wasn't something I went looking for, which made me think, okay, there's got to be something to this. And then the more I studied some of these great philosophers, the more you realize that a lot of what they're doing is interacting with the best science of the day or the best math of the day. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then, so that was definitely a revolutionary idea.
Yes. Yeah. I can imagine it would have been. And it's fascinating to me. I think just in hearing your story, when I was growing up, I can't say that I was particularly gifted at numbers at all. I always wanted to be good at numbers. There were some things in science that I really did enjoy. And yet I don't think I really understood what it was for and how it was just relevant and important for my life. Yeah. Beyond being able to calculate what I'm supposed to do with my taxes or something like that.
Right, exactly.
How would you have spoken to a guy like me? What do you tell guys like me now who struggle with that? Because you can relate to that academic struggle in a very real way.
No, first of all, I think the question, okay, when are we ever going to use this? When you're doing math, when are we going to use this? Like that is such a natural question that people should ask. Mm-hmm. You should always be able to ask in a respectful, like, why am I studying this? There's got to be a purpose for whatever it is you're studying. Why is the curriculum like this? Why are we studying math? Why do you have basically from K to 12, just about 12 years of math. Yeah. And that's a lot of math. Right. And so naturally you're thinking, when am I ever going to use this? When am I ever going to use algebra, or trig, or even calculus? I'm not going into sciences or anything like that. It's almost like you think, are they trying to get everyone to go into science or the STEM disciplines? Well, no, it turns out that over the time, we've kind of lost why we do teach math. Right. And so we tend to teach it in this way that is geared towards what can I do with it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I have lots of things to say about like the math pedagogy that I'd like to change. Things like, we try to cram too many concepts into too little time. It'd be much better to focus on the really fewer high yield concepts and get really good at those and to know why it's all connected. But even beyond that, it's like, well, why, again, still, to what end is that? Well, I think there are a few reasons, a few things in it. I think the best way to not just tell people why it's important, but to show them why, and you can't do that if you don't have time with them. But in class that I teach seniors, I have a year with them. And so we can go through, all right, let's start with the questions that Plato was asking. And even before, the stuff that he got from others. It turns out he gets a lot from the Pythagoreans. You would think that, most of us know Pythagoras from, calculating the triangle. That's it. Yeah. But it turns out that Plato, so many of his ideas and core ideas, he got from the Pythagoreans, and then made them much, clarified them and made them even more powerful. But it turns out that Plato thought that the world, the cosmos, is fundamentally mathematical, and that God made the world according to these mathematical principles. Even humans, I mean, everything was just according to, and you think that's really bizarre. And when you're reading this in philosophy, usually the people who are reading philosophy aren't into math, so they just kind of gloss over that. And it's like, that must be just, Plato was, it was a long time ago. He was kind of weird in some ways. He's not going to get everything right. So he happened to have this particular interest in math. It turns out that it was like he was onto something that all of the, so many of the philosophers end up latching onto. So I have time in that class to go through that entire history. One of the key ways I show, why are we studying this, is to look at maybe Plato's most important work, The Republic, where he sets out, this curriculum for the leaders of the city. And the leaders of the city have to be philosophers. Of course, he'd say that. Right. And one of the ways he ends up training them, a main way, is that he says, look, they got to study the 4 sister arts: astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music or harmonics. That ends up becoming 4 of the 7 traditional liberal arts. And you go, okay. So it wasn't just Plato. That was something that he planted these seeds, and it grew throughout Western history, and Christendom in the Middle Ages pick up on this idea of a liberal arts curriculum. And it's amazing how much, just looking at numbers, 4/7 of the liberal arts are these mathematical sciences that Plato got from the Pythagoreans. That makes no sense if you just if you don't understand what he was thinking. And so part of that first initial, let me show you how important this is and why we're doing this. It goes back to a traditional liberal arts education at the very beginning of Western civilization. And now that doesn't tell you why it's important, but it gives you a hint of, okay, if Plato thought it was that important and everyone else thought it was that important enough to codify it into these 7 liberal arts, there must be something to it.
Sure. Yes.
So that's the beginning.
Yes.
And then you start following that. Okay, well, why did Plato do that? And you start realizing that there's this aspect of mathematics that, he thinks it's not just mental training so that you can get good at thinking abstractly, though it is partly that. It's also that the universe, the cosmos, including humans, he thought, were fundamentally mathematical. And so by doing mathematics, and not just doing problems, but understanding it,
right,
you start understanding something of the way God made the world. So you start understanding something of God, and you start understanding something of the way humans are. Now, it's not like if you're doing 2 + 2 = 4, you're doing word problems. That's not clear. You're Stan starts out at 35 miles an hour going east, and then you're thinking, okay, I'm not sure how that's supposed to get to the most fundamental questions. But it turns out it's okay, well, what's the fundamental nature of reality? And if you don't know that, you're constrained by what is. I just heard this. I was just we happened to be listening to Al Mohler, and he said that. It's just you can't. What you believe and what kinds of views you have to be constrained by reality, or sooner or later you're going to bump up against reality, and you'll wish you'd change. And then as we keep going through the course, you keep unraveling that and saying, okay, well, what exactly was he talking about? Because it's still not absolutely clear. And then by the end of the course, you realize, wow, that actually is central to all kinds of things. But it's so hard. It's so hard to communicate that to people like us who have been trained a certain way.
Yes. Exactly. It's almost like we don't even have a muscle to actually process that at all.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a great way of putting it. Or like we're colorblind.
Yeah.
And it's like you just can't even see that. And it's like, no, this is here. You see this red versus green.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing that I try to teach the kids too. Is I say kids because I'm so old. They're adults, but they're kind of like my kids in a sense when I have them in the class. Teaching them to see that maybe they've been colorblind. Like, because with just regular colorblindness, you're not going to just be able to think your way out of it. But with something like this, because ideas kind of shape your lenses, it's like using this as like, if this is your worldview, all of the lenses are all these beliefs that focus things in a certain way and they're a certain color. If you had rose tinted glasses, you'd see the world differently. And so but in the world of ideas, you actually can see through and modify the way you think.
Right. I find that so important to understand, and I'd love your commentary on this because I tend to think that as Christians, by and large, and I'm speaking in very general, broad terms here, we lack a robust cosmology. And we confine our Christian faith to only very few categories in life. We have this very narrow scope. And I think that's been well diagnosed. And I've just been thinking about the importance of having this cosmology. And I use that word very intentionally because what I tend to find is a Christianity that only speaks to appeals to very few areas of life leaves gaps for another worldview to dictate how we live in those other areas of life, which is why, and now this is speaking in very like apologetics terms, when you get something like atheism or just secularism, let's deal with secularism very specifically, it provides its own cosmology, right? And for as long as Christians don't have this cosmological vision of the world, they're not going to be able to speak to specific aspects of life.
Right.
And I think everything that you're speaking about in terms of Plato and the kind of questions that he was asking and how he kind of provided this foundation for the liberal arts, which then becomes, I guess specifically we're referring to the quadrivium, right? Very specifically. And how all that informs a robust cosmology of how to view the world, which is rich and I think so important, and which is why I'm such a strong proponent for the liberal arts and why it's so important. But just how, do you think that as I'm trying to diagnose this, that like I'm onto something, like what's the importance of building that cosmology, and is the liberal arts the way to develop that cosmology? And I'll tack one thing onto that is, I suppose, how do you speak to where faith resides in all of that? Because there's a sense in which Plato gives us this. But did Plato bow his knee to Christ? And where does that factor into developing this well-orbed cosmology that speaks to every aspect of life and every aspect of a person's being?
Right. Those are deep. That's deep. I mean, and I think that's good. I mean, that's exact. I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think you're getting at like one of the core benefits of, if you think of liberal arts as it's liberal arts produce something as opposed to, what do they produce? Well, one of the things they produce is a way to understand the world and how to learn and how to put things together, not just little bits of knowledge, but how to piece it all together. It produces other things too. But I think this is the key, and this is I think you bring up one of the main reasons that the quadrivium, or at least lessons from the quadrivium. I mean, math and science have moved on in a certain respect and grown, I should say. So I think if Plato, we can get to this if we have time, if Plato saw what we're doing now in terms of cosmology and mathematics, he would have been blown away. He had no, I mean, he was like, oh my gosh, I really was onto something. You know, probably it's good that he's dead because he'd have a big head. He'd be thinking,
I started all this.
Yeah, this is, and it's amazing. But the point of not having like little bits of a Christian worldview, you know, like, okay, so I know how to think Christianly about this. Then there's a kind of desert. You know, I don't even look at it. And here's how my faith bears on this and this and this. What we're trying to do, and one of the main things I'm trying to do in class, and I tell the students I'm doing this to them, you know, it's like, rather than just, I want you to have, you know, specific reasons for believing that the Christian worldview is the right one. And you have, you know, you can have arguments for God's existence. You can have arguments for the reliability of Scripture and all of that. But I think what's really powerful is if you can create this interlocking web where it's kind of like an electrical circuit, but it flows through everything. Now that's not easy. You know, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to do that. But I think one of the key ways of doing that is showing how Christianity makes a difference when it comes to integrating what we might call the sciences and the humanities.
Right.
Because that's a big thing. So right there, the first key when it comes to thinking about this is to realize we've siloed a lot of these disciplines. Exactly. And we certainly siloed, you know, like the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, from the, you know, the history and philosophy and literature. You know, so in C.P. Snow, he was back in like 1959, he was a chemist and a novelist. And he kind of had feet in the science, you know, in the science world and in the literature world, humanities world. And he has this famous, he gave this famous talk on the two cultures, humanities and science, he called it. And just how you know, he had a foot in both. Those cultures could not understand one another. Yeah. They usually spoke badly of one another. Yeah. But he found that both sides were so ignorant about what the other one was doing. And he saw that, so the lack of, say, philosophy that the scientists had made them worse scientists.
Right.
And the lack of science that the humanities people had made them worse at humanities. Exactly. And he's like, no, you got to see. So bridging these two cultures is kind of the key. And then, of course.
And on that, I want to know like how far close I am to this. The way I've tried to make sense of this is recognizing that science tells you what is, humanities tell you what ought. And like those different, like, and you need both. You need to know how to apply the humanities, which is something science is very good at doing. But you also need to understand the why questions and, you know, like how we ought to live, like the big philosophical questions that frame what science is aiming to do. Like this is why we're doing it. We're trying to discover, in Christian terms, God's world and how to live within it and the things that he has so intricately revealed to us. Is that a good way of framing it? The is and the ought.
Yeah, I do think that this kind of fact value thing is something that we tend to think, okay, if science is just facts. And where do you get values? Well, you get values over here when you're doing philosophy and literature and all that. But actually both are, you know, up to their necks in fact and value. Right. So like you have just look at the revolution that Einstein started back in the early 1900s. That was some of the things that he and other scientists were saying were bizarre. Like, it's not just, hey, look, here's a little something that, isn't it weird that a plant works this way, which is bizarre enough. No, this is something like the ultimate structure of reality is different. So there were other interpretations for that, like, say for quantum mechanics, he and Niels Bohr, they debated like so much on like whether or not quantum mechanics is the right theory. And Einstein's like, no, that's not how the world should be. The world isn't like that.
Right.
It's not, before you measure something, there is no such thing as a particle or whatever it is, whatever the interpretation of quantum mechanics was. And that was one of the ones for Niels Bohr. And Bohr's like, no, that why not? Yeah. He's like, well, God doesn't play that. Has that famous thing where he's just like, that's not the way the world should be. Right. And Bohr's like, well, stop telling God what to do. It's like, but notice what that debate is about. What should the world be like?
Right, exactly.
And so you have this data and this mathematics, and you have to interpret and figure out, okay, is that a reasonable theory? Well, I have to look at the kinds of things I think the world is like and the kind of values that I have. Like Einstein's very clear. He's like, no, that's not how the world should be.
Right. And I guess my question to that is like, what informs Einstein's idea of what should be?
His lenses, that whole worldview. And that's the thing. It's like we tend to think that when people are doing science, that they've got the science hat on and they can just kind of think that, well, I go and I punch my clock. When I have my science hat on, I just think about science. Sure. That is just not how people think. Exactly. And when the deeper you get into fundamental physics, like Einstein was doing, changing these fundamental theories, the more of your worldview comes into play. And notice, so as I'm looking, let's say I'm Einstein, I'm looking through my glasses. A lot of times, and this is all of us, I look through them. I'm not looking at them. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So I don't even see them. Right. Sometimes I'll be like, hey, where are my glasses? Oh, they're on my face. Right. And so when philosophers of science do this, they look at, well, what are those bigger assumptions that go into something like Einstein's evaluation of this? And so they're kind of analyzing what was his worldview, what were his lenses like, and then what should they have been? What should ours be now? Right. And it turns out that so much of his was based on a lot of philosophy that he had read.
Of course. Yeah.
So he's very much, and he was aware of it. He's like, yeah, no, this is how he was, and he talked about philosophy of science. This is one of the, the one scientist, Lee Smolin, he's a contemporary scientist. He diagnoses today's kind of the cul-de-sac that he says physics is in.
Yeah.
He says that the reason that we're in this cul-de-sac is that we don't have these visionaries like Einstein. After World War II, we kind of focused on just trying to do facts and just problems. Mm-hmm. But that's not how you choose theories. Yeah. You have to have the big picture. So anyways, look, Einstein is one of those great examples to use, and you'd have to look at the details to get more of an idea, but his worldview shaped what he thought counts as a good theory. Well, and the other thing too is and this is a big deal now, he thought that a theory should be beautiful. Mm. And he said, even maybe if there's a problem with the experiment says that the theory is wrong, unless there's really good, maybe it is saying that, but this theory is so beautiful, we should give it another chance. Right. And so you have this, particularly since Einstein, this thread of a theory has to be beautiful. And you think, okay, well, that started with Einstein. Actually, it didn't. It started with Plato. In the quadrivium, the big thing for him was, how do all these disciplines fit together and like harmony, this notion of beauty, right. Like harmonics or music. Yes. Harmonics for him was more than just music. It was this, study of harmony. And this harmony is this, when these individual things like a chord, a triad, like a music chord, right. 3 notes put together, each retain their individuality. Right. Like if you're good at music, you can still hear each individual note, but then they come together and they work together in this way that makes them, it's almost like, I don't even know how to explain it. Beautiful. Harmonious.
Right. Pleasant.
Yeah. And that was a huge deal for the Pythagoreans and for Plato. Mm. And again, that's this notion of aesthetics and beauty. We tend to think that that's not part of how we look at the world when it comes to hard facts. Right. And it's like, that's not.
That's just, yeah. The reason I find just everything you're saying so beautiful is, one of the things that came to mind for me as well was just like the necessity of having a beautiful theology as well. And one of the things that we've seen happen in the modern world is the divorce between faith and reason. And in the way you're speaking, you don't have those divides, right? Like there's something at the core of this where you're like, the two have to relate to one another. And I want you to speak to that. Just what's the correlation between faith and reason? I think some people often try to pit science as something that's void of faith and belief. And they like to pit faith and belief as something that's void of reason, rationality. And
right.
That's something that we need to address. There's so much I want to unpack here. There's one thing you said in your book here, in your introduction, that I thought was just so profound. And I wanted you to speak to this. And you said something to this effect. It isn't necessarily the strength of the arguments that rattle us, but the way they resonate with the unbeliever in each of us. Right? Like there's a sense in which belief is inescapable, is something that you're arguing here as well.
Yeah.
But how should we understand the relationship between faith and reason?
Yeah, and so some of it has to do with, how are we defining faith and reason? And I think some of that, there's an ambiguity that the debate can play on, and so it's like, okay, well, let's time out, and that's why in the book, in that book in particular, I go through and say, okay, first of all, what are we talking about? What are they talking about when it comes, when they say faith versus reason? And what you end up seeing is, so usually what they mean by faith is that like you just assume something or believe something without any evidence. Right. And, again, if you think on the one hand, it's almost like you define faith as believing something irrationally, then you're like, well, of course. Like if that's how you define it, but if you said, and this a lot of this comes from just Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Wolterstorff. I'm basically just repeating what they say for a general audience. If you look at if you think, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about faith? It usually boils down to, primarily you're believing something by way of, you're trusting. You're like trusting testimony.
Right.
What someone tells you. It turns out, though, that when you start okay, so you're believing something on trust, on their well, even going back to someone like David Hume, the great agnostic of the Enlightenment, he says, look, we believe in the testimony of the senses.
Yeah.
So you have testimony of what your eyes are telling you.
Right.
So there's a sense, and you can't step outside your eyes to check. And that was one of the big things with Hume. He's like, actually, there is no good argument that you're not a computer he didn't say computer simulation, but there's an external world outside your mind, that you're not hooked up to the matrix or whatever it is. Yeah. And pretty much that's it. Everyone kind of concedes, yeah, that's true. You don't have an argument for a non-circular argument for the reliability of your senses, at least in that sense. And so Plantinga goes through and he says, look at all these ways in which faith, us trusting things without an argument, ends up being everywhere. Yeah. So then it can't be just in virtue of believing without an argument that, again, notice the assumption there, that we're believing in Christianity without any arguments at all, which I think that's not true either. It's like, but let's say you did, it can't be in virtue of us not believing by way of an argument that makes faith in Christ bad. It's got to be something else. So, and that's what philosophy does best, is you start going through and like you slow down. You go, okay, I know you just said faith and reason are contrary to one another. Hold up. What do you mean by faith? And so that's what we mean by thinking in slow motion. Right. Like let's figure out, what do we mean by that? Is that right? And then being careful and trying to analyze the argument, and then you find, well, okay, that's not the argument. It might be this, and then you focus on this. Okay, now here's the argument. Yeah. And that's what philosophy is so great at, and why Christian philosophy is so. I mean, philosophy is critical for everyone, but in a Christian philosophy is just like, we should embrace good philosophy.
Right. Exactly.
So it turns out that faith ends up being something, you're trusting in something. It's inescapable for creatures like us.
Right. You're absolutely right. I mean, I recall the apostles, as they're proclaiming the gospel, they actually appeal to the logic of it and the reason of it. Well-crafted arguments, and they don't seem to be putting away reason at all.
Right.
In fact, they say that their faith is perfectly reasonable, which is why they believe it.
Yeah, right. It seems like it's like all of that's predicated on, if it wasn't reasonable, we wouldn't believe it.
Exactly the point. Yeah.
So it can't be, and I think sometimes people, the bad rap that reason gets is that it's this hyper rationalism that's not realistic.
Yeah.
Where you just you think that you're being rational, and you don't realize that reason isn't the only thing that comes into inference a lot of times. And the other thing too is this notion of, you know what, if I can't understand it, I'm not going to believe it.
Yeah.
Now, that's a terrible rule of thumb.
Right.
Now, it's good sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, I should be, but if you say, I'm not going to believe anything that I don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrible.
Yeah. No, you'll miss out on a lot of truths.
Yeah, exactly. Doubting Thomas.
Yeah. You're like, okay.
A resurrected Lord, a resurrected human being. And that's kind of what it begins to assault when we begin to think that way as well. Those rich truths that have been revealed to us in God's word. And also recognizing that our own contemplations of the world aren't the sum of reality.
Right. Right. Oh, absolutely. And that's what is so fascinating about, like, and this is one of the things I talk about. I think we were talking about this, like, what are some of the main arguments against Christianity or against belief in God? Yeah. And one of them is the problem of evil, which I think is a very powerful argument, because I think anyone that says, oh yeah, no, I totally understand why God would have allowed this, and I don't think that, I mean, you might be able to get senses where a few times where you see, okay, if that hadn't happened, that wouldn't happen. And so, but by and large, I think we just have to be quiet about God's reasons. But what's interesting is that the problem of evil, as it's leveled at Christians or any theists, is that it's based on or predicated on a God that's like infinitely wise or infinitely knowledgeable.
Right.
If he knew everything, he would. he knows all the evil that's happening. It's not like he didn't, I didn't catch that one. So you have this, he's all powerful, he's all loving, and he's all knowing. The whole problem is predicated on a God that has this almost maybe infinite knowledge, but we would say, well, I can't think of any reason why God would do that. Right. So therefore, there's no reason why God would do that. And you're like, seriously? You looked around? I mean, and I totally get, I'm not downplaying the emotional, existential power of the problem of evil, because I think there is something there. And I think if you didn't have a struggle, there'd be something wrong. But the rationality of it, some of it is like, I don't know if just because I can't think of a reason means that God doesn't have a reason. That's,
Or even just going back to the question of why does evil matter in a world in which God doesn't exist? Is often my retort to them.
Yeah.
It's like, why does that bother you?
Right.
Why does evil bother you? Unless you believe that there's some absolute standard by which man ought to live by. And the kind of standard that's etched into absolutely everything. It's etched into the world. It's etched into reality. And that's inescapable. Otherwise, this thing that you refer to as evil, isn't that just a natural process of life? Is that not just...
Well, and that was one of Lewis's arguments. Right. It's like, hey, look, you never tell me if I butt you in line. Like, there's no moral law. That's not wrong. You make an excuse and try to measure up to the moral law.
That's exactly.
But if you were an atheist, you could say, if you were big enough and strong enough and powerful enough, and you wanted to, and you just go, yeah, that's nice, and then just stand in line.
Exactly. Dr. Stokes, I wish I could talk to you for hours on end. I'm actually like, we need to do a part 2, maybe a part 3, honestly, just because there's so much to unpack in all this.
Well, that was fun. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate this. And we need to do another one. We really do. I like to end my conversations with toasts. So is there anything that you'd like us to toast to as we end this conversation?
To the unity of knowledge in Christ and the freedom in this country for now to pursue it.
Cheers.